The rise and fall of empires has always fascinated historians, philosophers, and psychologists alike. Yet the question we rarely ask is not how empires fall, but why they fall in the ways they do. Most people imagine that ancient empires crumbled due to external invasions, economic collapse, or corrupt leadership. And while these factors certainly play a role, they are merely symptoms of a deeper, often invisible force: the way human systems respond to complexity, stress, and the limits of perception. Imagine a brain as a network of neurons constantly firing, balancing excitation and inhibition, and then scale that up to entire societies. Just as a neural network can become unstable when overloaded, so too can the interconnected systems of an empire falter not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of the cumulative weight of misaligned adaptation. This subtle, almost imperceptible drift, the slow erosion of systemic balance, is what ultimately defines the trajectory of civilizations. And yet it is not always catastrophic in the sense we expect. Sometimes, these collapses are the result of mechanisms that paradoxically preserve the core of a society's essence, even as its outer structures dissolve. Throughout history, empires have repeatedly shown patterns that reveal more about the human mind than they do about military strategy or geography. The Roman Empire, for instance, did not fall solely due to barbarian invasions. It collapsed under the invisible pressure of overextension, bureaucratic entropy, and the collective stress of managing a population that had grown beyond the system's capacity to perceive risk accurately. In modern terms, the Roman state experienced a form of cognitive overload. Its leadership could no longer process information efficiently. Its institutions became rigid, and its ability to respond adaptively to environmental shocks, whether economic, social, or climatic, was diminished. This mirrors what we observe in individual cognition. When our neural pathways are overloaded, our decision-making deteriorates, often resulting in avoidance, oversimplification, or maladaptive coping strategies. In empires, these patterns scale up, transforming individual cognitive biases into societal pathologies. What seems like external failure, a sacking by foreign forces, is often preceded by centuries of internal misalignment between perception, capacity, and reality. The psychological framework of stress and adaptation provides another lens to understand the fall of civilizations. Humans have evolved to respond to immediate threats with highly tuned fight or flight responses, but complex social structures amplify threats into abstract, delayed, or distributed forms. When an empire faces environmental pressures, resource scarcity, or political instability, the collective stress is diffused across millions of individuals and thousands of institutional nodes. This diffusion creates feedback loops that are not linear. Small perturbations can cascade into major disruptions. The Mayan civilization, for instance, experienced cycles of drought that stressed agricultural systems and triggered social upheaval. Yet, if we examine the archaeological record closely, we see that the collapse was not abrupt but episodic, marked by periods of partial recovery and adaptation. These intermittent adaptations suggest that the system was not simply failing. It was constantly negotiating its limits, experimenting with resilience strategies, and recalibrating collective behavior under stress. In other words, collapses are not always failures. They can be signals of systemic self-regulation, attempting to prevent more catastrophic breakdowns. Consider the metaphor of energy networks, which can illuminate another dimension of historical decline. Just as electrical grids must balance generation, transmission, and consumption, empires maintain stability through the management of resources, information, and authority. Disruptions occur not solely from external shocks, but from imbalances within the network. Corruption acts like resistance in a circuit. Miscommunication is akin to voltage loss, and excessive centralization functions as a bottleneck that reduces redundancy and flexibility. When the Byzantine Empire faced repeated invasions, internal dissent, and economic strain, it did not simply fall overnight. It experienced systemic oscillations akin to a fluctuating power grid, which eventually led to localized collapses in certain provinces while other areas adapted and persisted. This nuanced perspective reframes collapse not as a singular event, but as a dynamic interplay of resilience, vulnerability, and adaptive thresholds across interconnected nodes of a complex system. Neuropsychology offers further insight into why empires fail in ways that often surprise us. Cognitive biases such as overconfidence, confirmation bias, And groupthink can scale up from individual decision-makers to entire ruling classes. Leaders may interpret early warning signals incorrectly, prioritize immediate gains over long-term sustainability, or ignore inconvenient data that challenges their worldview. Over time, these biases accumulate, subtly reshaping the empire's trajectory. The Qing dynasty, for example, faced mounting internal pressures and external threats in the 19th century. Its downfall was accelerated not merely by foreign intervention, but by entrenched institutional conservatism that misread both domestic dissatisfaction and international shifts. Here we see the metaphorical equivalent of a brain that continues to reinforce maladaptive neural circuits. Despite repeated negative feedback, the empire persists in part because its structures resist change, yet this resistance itself becomes a driver of eventual collapse. Philosophically, the rise and fall of empires invites reflection on the limits of human perception and the illusion of control. Civilizations are often treated as monolithic entities, but in reality they are emergent phenomena, arising from countless interactions between individuals, institutions, and environmental contexts. The fall of an empire is rarely the story of a single decisive moment. It is the story of accumulated micro-decisions, small misalignments, and delayed feedback loops. From the perspective of complexity science, this is an expected outcome: highly interconnected systems, while robust against isolated shocks, are inherently vulnerable to systemic stress. In a way, history teaches us that the very mechanisms that allow civilizations to thrive, their ability to centralize power, accumulate knowledge, and coordinate vast networks, also plant the seeds of their eventual transformation or decline. It is the paradox of complex adaptation. What enables stability in one moment can predispose instability in the next. Yet, there is another layer that is less commonly acknowledged: the protective aspect of collapse. While the dissolution of institutions, cities, or dynasties may appear purely destructive, these processes often function as a form of evolutionary pruning. Consider the Bronze Age civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean, which experienced widespread disruption around 1200 BCE. On the surface, this seems catastrophic. Yet, archaeological evidence also suggests that these collapses allowed for the reorganization of societies, fostering new political structures, technological innovations, and social configurations better suited to emerging conditions. In neurobiological terms, this is analogous to synaptic pruning. The removal of inefficient or maladaptive connections strengthens the overall network, improving long-term adaptability. The very weaknesses that we perceive as failure can, paradoxically, be the system's way of preserving its potential for future resilience. This perspective also reframes the notion of weakness in leadership or institutions. Moments in which a ruler appears indecisive, bureaucracies seem inefficient, or collective response seems sluggish may actually be manifestations of distributed intelligence at work. By diffusing stress, allowing slower feedback loops, and creating spaces for local adaptation, these apparent weaknesses can prevent catastrophic overreactions. For example, in feudal Japan, decentralized power structures allowed for localized adaptation and experimentation, which in many ways insulated regions from the kind of systemic collapse seen in more centralized empires. What seems like fragility is often a subtle form of risk management, an emergent property of complex social systems that mirrors the brain's own balance between excitation and inhibition. History repeatedly demonstrates that collapses are not uniform or absolute. They are selective, uneven, and often constructive in ways that challenge conventional narratives. In the Inca Empire, the Spanish conquest was devastating. Yet indigenous knowledge systems, agricultural practices, and cultural traditions persisted, often in hybrid forms that shaped the modern Andes. Similarly, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in Europe did not erase literacy, law, or engineering knowledge. It redistributed it, creating conditions for future renaissance and innovation. This redistribution is a key insight. What we perceive as an empire's end is rarely the end of its influence or potential. It is a reconfiguration of energy, information, and social networks, a systemic recalibration that preserves certain elements while discarding others. This resonates with modern ideas in network theory, where resilience is not the absence of disruption, but the capacity to reorganize and adapt following perturbation. If we explore these patterns through the lens of perception, a fascinating paradox emerges. Empires often fail precisely because their success blinds them to emergent vulnerabilities. The human brain prioritizes familiar signals, patterns that have historically predicted survival and outcomes that reinforce learned expectations. In large societies, institutions adopt similar perceptual filters, focusing on short-term gains, known threats, and dominant narratives. This selective attention allows for remarkable efficiency in stable conditions, but creates blind spots in times of unprecedented change. The Ottoman Empire, for example, endured centuries of expansion and administrative success. Yet when faced with rapid technological and geopolitical shifts in the 18th and 19th centuries, its institutions struggled to perceive the magnitude of external pressures. In this sense, the very mechanisms that sustain empires, their learned heuristics, cultural inertia, and cognitive routines can become the source of vulnerability when conditions deviate from historical norms. Moreover, the collapse of empires is deeply intertwined with collective psychology. Human beings are social animals whose behaviors are profoundly shaped by shared beliefs, expectations, and narratives. When collective confidence erodes, the system experiences a form of social stress analogous to individual anxiety. Decision-making slows, risk tolerance diminishes, and coordination falters. The French Revolution illustrates this phenomenon vividly. Decades of fiscal strain, social inequality, and perceived legitimacy deficits created a tipping point, where the collective psyche of the populace triggered rapid institutional transformation. Here, collapse is not merely a political event. It is a social-emotional process, reflecting the alignment or misalignment between societal perception and environmental reality. Understanding this allows us to reinterpret historical crises as emergent phenomena, arising from the interaction between material constraints and human cognition. At the heart of this analysis lies a profound insight. The apparent end of an empire often masks a more subtle continuity. Systems that appear to fail externally may actually be protecting their internal coherence or preserving the conditions for future adaptation. Consider the concept of creative destruction, frequently applied to economics but equally relevant to historical societies. Disruptive events, while devastating in the short term, can eliminate maladaptive structures, redistribute resources more efficiently, and catalyze innovation. From the perspective of a historian or a systems theorist, what seems like collapse is often a necessary phase in a larger cycle of evolution. A cycle that is not only material, but psychological, cultural, and cognitive. This perspective invites us to reflect on our own assumptions about strength, stability, and failure. We tend to equate the outward appearance of power with lasting resilience. Yet history teaches that adaptability, perception management, and distributed intelligence are often more critical than centralized control. The decline of ancient empires is a mirror for human cognition itself, revealing the limits of perception, the consequences of rigid heuristics, and the hidden benefits of systemic recalibration. In other words, the story of ancient civilizations is a story of the mind writ large, how networks, feedback loops, stress, and adaptation interact to produce both remarkable achievements and inevitable transformations. Finally, we must confront the philosophical dimension. What does it mean for an empire to fall? If the loss of territory, the collapse of institutions, or the erosion of centralized authority are accompanied by the preservation of knowledge, culture, and adaptive potential, can we truly call it failure? Perhaps the real lesson is that empires, like individuals, are defined not by moments of external triumph or disaster, but by their capacity to learn, reconfigure, and transmit resilience across generations. The rise and fall of civilizations is less a linear narrative of conquest and defeat than a dynamic, ongoing negotiation between complexity, perception, and adaptation. Every collapse carries within it the seeds of regeneration, every apparent weakness conceals mechanisms of protection, and every historical paradox invites us to question the simplicity of cause and effect. As you reflect on this, consider your own mental and social networks. How do you perceive stress, complexity, and failure? What hidden adaptive mechanisms might be at work in your own decisions, your own institutions, and your own communities? History provides not only a mirror of our past, but a guide to navigating the intricate interplay between resilience and vulnerability, structure and flexibility, perception and reality. The real reason empires fell is not a single cause, a dramatic invasion, or a fatal mistake. It is the subtle interplay of human cognition, collective behavior, systemic limits, and adaptive processes that unfold over generations, often invisible until they manifest as collapse. Understanding this transforms our view of history from a series of dramatic events into a living study of human systems, revealing patterns that are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. So next time you read about the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, or the decline of the Qing, remember that these events are not simply stories of failure. They are lessons in perception, adaptation, and systemic intelligence. They remind us that weakness and strength are relative, that collapse can be protective, and that the boundaries of human systems are defined not only by what they endure, but by how they reorganize in response. By exploring history through this lens, we gain insight, not only into the past, but into the enduring principles that govern complex systems, both societal and cognitive, and perhaps into our own potential to navigate the unforeseen challenges of the future. If this perspective reshapes the way you see history, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Hit the like button if you learned something new, and subscribe to Pastlens for more explorations into the hidden patterns that shape human civilization.